Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. Is the chaos in Somalia having an impact in the United States and Europe? Last year, more than a dozen young Somali men went missing from their communities in the United States and in Europe. It later became apparent that they had gone back to their homeland, possibly to join armed groups. In one case, one student from Minnesota University carried out a suicide bombing. That incident and the case of the disappearing students has shocked the Somali community here in the United States. So today we ask, is the chaos in Somalia spilling over and becoming a security threat to countries around the world? You can join our conversation with your questions and comments, and we welcome your phone calls on the show as well. Joining us today, Mohammed Dini, a Somali-American community activist and lay preacher from Columbus, Ohio. From Minneapolis, we have Hussein Samatta, who until recently hosted a radio show that focused on Somalis in the United States. He founded the African Development Center in Minnesota. And with me here in the studio is Jennifer Cook, the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the major think tanks here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Samatta, I'm going to start with you.
Great to be with you.
Mr. Samatta, I'm going to start with you. There appears to be some contradictory statements about these students going back to Somalia and joining armed groups over there. We hear from some people who say that, yes, they do pose a threat, that they are going back and they're joining groups that are actually deemed terrorist groups by the United States. Others say there's no evidence to support this. What have you been hearing?
There is no doubt in our minds as the Somali-American community in Minnesota that the young men who went back quite a while now are joining and joined militia groups in Somalia. There's no question about that. The questions are about how could that be possible, who helped them, and what they are doing now exactly in Somalia. But the fact, I think, there's no controversy that they went back to fight.
Because this is being looked at very seriously here in the United States. We have the new CIA director, Leon Panetta, and he was speaking to journalists in February, and this is what he said. He said the relationship between Somalis here in the United States and in Somalia raises real concerns about the potential for terrorist activity.
That is really, I think, a statement that has no facts behind it. The Somali community here in Minnesota that I can speak of, I'm sure Mohammed can speak, the other states, that the state that he's in, has been extremely exemplary immigrants trying their best. And as you know, that Somalia as a country has seen a lot of difficulties, and the community has been thriving and starting businesses, students graduating from universities and becoming mainstream communities. So therefore, we are, as an American, as anybody else, love this country dearly, and we understand how to really avoid a war, because, as you know it, we came from a very difficult country. So that statement, as far as I'm concerned, is not based on specific facts. If the director has something else that he wants to tell us, we'll love to listen, but otherwise what I would say is really that it should be more specific than that.
Yeah, and I think I should add that what we're talking about here is a very small number of people, no more than a dozen. I want to turn now to Jennifer Cook here in the studio. Looking at it from a geopolitical view, how important is Somalia to the United States in terms of its national security?
Well, it's been very important, particularly in the perception of policymakers so far, on the counterterrorism segment. The bomb attacks against embassies in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam received some support from transit support from Somalia, terrorist activities passing through Somalia, although the al-Qaeda cells in those cases were based in Nairobi. Somalia also has an impact on the broader region, and the entanglements with Ethiopia and Eritrea, some of those conflicts are playing out in Somalia. And most recently, Somalia has been on the U.S. agenda because the accusations that some of the Islamic Courts Union, which came to power in Mogadishu 2 years ago, was providing safe haven to a number of high-value al-Qaeda targets. U.S. has tended to see Somalia through this very narrow prism of counterterrorism, and I think has missed the much larger picture of what's going on. And I think if we do so, if we continue to see it through that very narrow prism, we're not going to get any closer to a solution ultimately.
Well, let me ask you about that. There was a time, albeit a very short time, in June 2006, where there was a semblance of stability in Somalia, in Mogadishu, when the Islamic Courts Union was in government, or at least was running the country at that point. Was it a mistake of the United States to support the ouster of the Islamic Courts Union by Ethiopian troops?
I think it absolutely was. Our mistakes in Somalia go back far longer than the Bush administration. Essentially, we walked away after the Black Hawk Down incident. We cordoned the country off. We didn't have a good understanding what was going on internally in the country. When this Islamic Courts Union began to establish some modicum of stability within Mogadishu, we kept that counterterrorism focus solely and kind of painted the courts with this broad brush as that they're terrorists. We will not engage with them prior to the potential invasion of Ethiopia or after. Our support for the Ethiopian invasion, I think, undermined our leverage. I think it helped radicalize some elements of the courts and has left us with the situation we see today.
Well, let's go to Mohammed Dini in Columbus, Ohio. Mohammed, you work among the community, the Somali community there in Columbus, Ohio. You're a lay preacher, as we pointed out. Have you found that Somali young men and Somali young men, youth, have been radicalized by what is going on in their homeland? What are you hearing in the community there?
I have not, and adding on to what Brother Samatar said, these are the kind of things that you often hear from the press and folks talking about this as far as a real thing that's happening within the community. I haven't seen one. I've heard of some things here and there, but the thing is, we live in a country where evidence has to be brought against anything that's said. Thus far, there is no evidence that anyone here in Columbus or anywhere else, for that matter, has committed any act of terrorism against anybody, for one. Number two, terrorism, you have to understand, my friend, is something that's foreign to both the Somali custom and culture and the Islamic faith. And often this is a term that we use without complete and deep knowledge of what it truly means. For instance, I've heard Jennifer just say that the Somalia had come to the scope of the U.S. government since '06. The fact of the matter is that the Somali people were terrorized for 18 years, 16 years prior to that, by folks who were not religious, who were not doing it in the name of God, who were not Islamic scholars. Secular terrorism is more of a problem to Somalia than religious terrorism, and that's what we ought to be talking about. Now, the past 2 years, 18 years, people were killed, raped, maimed. So sometimes it's important that we look at everything and try to get to the bottom of the problem. As far as what we have here in Columbus, and I'm sure Hussein can speak about what's going on in his state in Minnesota, we don't have any problem. Our hope and prayer is that we don't happen to have some in the future. As far as the kids that are missing, it's obviously a tragedy. It's a problem for all of us. It's a concern for all of us. Again, an evidence has to be brought against individuals. When we find out who those folks are, then we can go ahead and address the problem. As of right now, no mosque, no person, no nothing. So it's basically anyone's guess to talk about what's happening thus far.
Right, but what we're talking about here, I agree with what you're saying. What we're talking about here, the fact that young men have gone missing. There are reports that they may have gone to Somalia and joined armed groups. There is one report that one student carried out a suicide bombing in Somalia. That must be of some concern to the community, the Somali community in the United States.
It is, and I'm not saying that it's not. It's definitely a concern. I mean, this is a human problem, first of all. A mother and a father who had who are missing their kids is a human problem. This is not Somali or American or Jamaican for that matter. But the fact of the matter is this: we have a problem, so that is a problem. It's important that we, A, get these kids back home safe and sound to their parents. Number two, it's also equally important that we don't cause more harm in the process of solving this very problem. Now, we have one problem. We got to make sure that we take care of that without causing more harm to Islamic centers, mosques, and other individuals. And I think if we all get together, the Islamic leadership, folks like Mr. Samatar, Jennifer, and so forth, the authorities, I think we can get to the bottom of this. So this did happen. How to solve it is a whole different story that we all ought to talk about.
Okay, okay. Mr. Samatar, I want to get back to you. We have received an email here from Paris, France, from Bruno Drueski, and he writes, what are the frustrations that a young Somali feels being in North American society?
Really, I love the question. The Somali community, again, as I said, in the United States, and I was last 2 years ago was a German Marshall Fellow from the United States to Europe, has been extremely trying as hard as they can based on the background that they came with to be part of this community. And I really would love to share, anybody who's listening out there, I've said that, I have written about it. In the United States, in Minnesota, it is one of the best places in the world to be a practicing Muslim. Example, just to give you a couple of quick facts, since the community came early in the 1990s, we have created over 20 mosques throughout the state of Minnesota, and fairly to be able to pray and worship however they want to, as long as it's peaceful, which has been the case. Obviously, we have this issue, and we need to deal with Mohammed put it in a very good framework. Some of the frustrations of the young men are not different what France has also been seeing in their also suburbs, and especially people from descendant of North Africa. So what we see is really that the young men who sometimes drop out school and are just frustrated with their own performance and how they could be part of the society. And I think that's not really particularly issue only for the Somali community, but it's an issue for all the immigrant groups, plus the people who have been in the United States for some time. And those are social issues that we need to deal with. But overall, again, as I said it, the Somali-American community will tell you any given time that the United States, and Minnesota in particular, is one of the best states to practicing Muslim.
Okay, we are going to... You want to say something? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of very positive ties between the Somali diaspora and Somalis living in Somalia. Remittances, business ties, people travel back a lot. On the youth issue, I think there's a lot of anger within Somalia, not directed entirely at the United States, but over the last 2 years, especially at the Ethiopians. And what we see as kind of a jihad, or the U.S. sometimes terms this jihadi movement, is really seen by many in Somalia as a legitimate insurgency against an occupying force. And I think the anger, and perhaps our colleagues in the Midwest can correct me, but I think a lot of the anger that was happening within Somali society at the Ethiopian occupation, I mean, I think that might be compelling to a young man who's angry at the injustice, at the perceived injustice of this. And I think we need to better understand the Somali situation and get to the nuances more, rather than painting, you know, terror. This is a jihadi terror group. You know, we haven't gotten the real situation across,
right,
I think.
Right. I think that was a point that Mohammed Dini was making earlier on. We'll continue with this. We have to take a break right now. More of our discussion about Somalia and the Somali community in a moment. Stay with us.